is Humpty Dumpling, and this is the Basstravaganza. Since this is the first episode of the Basstravaganza, or at least the first one on video, I should tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Humpty Dumpling, and I live in this old Volvo station wagon. And like most normal people, well, since this is the first episode of the Basstravaganza, or at least the first one on video, I should tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Humpty Dumpling, and I live in this old Volvo station wagon. And like most normal people, my life is divided into three main parts. 1/3 of the time, I'm out fishing. Another third of the time, I'm probably getting ready to go fishing again. And the rest of the time, I'm recovering from the last time I went fishing. And one of these three boats you see behind me here, the mighty bullship, my little electric-powered pontoon boat, the stealth bomber, or maybe even the little inflatable kayak. As long as we get out on the water. Well, that's enough about myself. So with what you know about me, you might guess that the show will be about fishing. And you might guess from the title of the show that it'll be about bass fishing. And you're right, partly. Reminds me of a book I read once called Trout Fishing in America. The author submitted it to a big publishing company at the time, Viking Press, but they rejected it. They said, Mr. Browdigan, he's the author, Mr. Browdigan submitted a book to us in 1962 called Trout Fishing in America. I gather from the reports that it was not about trout fishing. Well, actually, they were wrong. The book was about trout fishing. It wasn't a textbook on how to tie flies or how to catch the most fish or the biggest fish. So you can see by looking at the author, he's the guy on the cover here, he was a man who had a limited attention span and he got sidetracked really easily. So the book wanders off the topic of fishing. It's more about the strange things that happen on the way to and from trout fishing, or the bizarre point of view the trout fishing author takes, like the beautiful waterfall he could see at the end of the street where he grew up, and how he would fantasize about all the trout that he'd catch there under that waterfall when he got old enough to be able to ride his bicycle down there, and how disappointed he was when he finally did get old enough to pedal his bike to the end of the street and he found out that what he thought was a waterfall was really just a stairway leading up to a big house hidden in some trees. But he didn't give up on fishing, and Mr. Browdigan eventually did find a publisher for his book, and even though it's not a tutorial on how to catch fish, it actually became something of a minor classic. The Basstravaganza will be like this. We'll catch some bass, but that's not all. So if you're looking for a show that will hook you up with the latest stuff you can buy that will catch the most bass fastest, or catch the biggest bass, or lead you to the hottest bass lakes, you're in the wrong place. There are lots of TV shows that cater to you. If you want to see rock star TV fishermen guided into hot fishing spots and watch them reel in one bass after another, and tell you all about all the stuff you need to buy from their sponsor so that you can catch fish the way they do, I got a suggestion for you. Pick up that remote control gizmo. Yeah, that's the one right beside you there on the couch. That's right. And then point it at your TV. And now press that red button in the upper left. Yeah, that's right. The one that says OFF. All right. We got rid of them. We didn't want them watching the Basstravaganza anyway. They can go back to watching Bass Masters. So now, for the 2 or 3 of you left that are still watching, here's what we plan to do on this show. We're going to start off by looking at the history of fishing and try to understand how it's split over time into 2 different directions, commercial fishing and recreational fishing. And this show is focused on fishing as recreation. So next we're going to talk about the evolution of recreational fishing and how it also split into 2 main types, fly fishing and spin fishing. And then we'll drill down to focus on the development of individual fishing lures, especially bass lures that were largely invented and perfected right here in North America. And finally, I will turn to the future, and I build my own lures. So always using the wisdom of the ancients as a guide. So once I get a lure ready, I'll head out and test it on the lakes and rivers of Vancouver Island and wherever else the Basstravaganza might lead us. So this could become a kind of reality TV show, but not some idiot network reality TV show where they fly Paris Hilton and some of her skanky Hollywood friends out to an island and they get to vote on who goes and who stays. This will be real reality. The audience will get to root for or against a particular lure. So if you think a lure is stupid and hopeless, you can hiss and boo when I tie it on. Or if you think it's a really good lure, you can root for that one to do well, and you can cheer when I tie it on, and who knows what will happen when the lure finally hits the water. And rest assured, like that guy that wrote Trout Fishing in America, the Basstravaganza will not hesitate to get distracted or wander off topic or follow faint trails that seem to lead nowhere. We'll catch some bass, but we will not limit ourselves to catching only bass. And we will not limit ourselves only to fishing because, after all, in order to be a good fisherman, you soon find out that you have to learn all there is to know about the fish you're after and the environment they live in, which means you also have to know everything about hydrology and biology and geology and geomorphology, which implies that you have to know everything about chemistry and physics, and basically it means that if you want to be a good fisherman, you have to know everything about everything, which is impossible, which is why there are no good fishermen. So if we look back into time, we find that fishing has a long history. In fact, it predates the evolution of man. Now, I realize that some of you maybe don't believe in evolution. You should change the channel right now and go back to watching Bassmasters. So scientists have documented fishing behavior in a number of different species of monkeys and apes. This picture shows a long-tailed macaque monkey that has just grabbed a fish out of a stream. That's about as basic as you can get with fishing. Orangutans have been found that use tools to catch fish. This one is hanging from a tree and using a branch to try to spear a fish. And this orangutan is using a stick to beat the water. He's trying to scare a fish into jumping onto the bank where he can grab them. So you can see evolution at work here. You can see where this is all heading. The fishing gene is wired really deep into the human genome. Fishing was essential to the success and evolution of humanity. Scientists speculate that human hunter-gatherers first evolved over 1 million years ago, but it was only 125,000 years ago that they expanded out from the continent of their origin, Africa, and they did it for a reason. So they could get a better cable TV package, one that offered the Bassmasters. No, that's not right. No, they migrated out of Africa to harvest beds of giant clams that lived in the Red Sea. And if they were digging clams there, they were probably catching fish too. Archaeologists in the Congo Basin have dated 90,000-year-old middens where bone harpoons are mixed with piles of fish remains. So this fishing behavior is hardwired deep into our souls. And it's also hardwired into the souls of the Aboriginal people here on Vancouver Island. Ever since the end of the last ice age, when the glaciers left town around here, Aboriginal people have been living here in some of the oldest continuously occupied villages that exist anywhere on Earth. The climate here is so wet and cool, and the land is so steep, and the rainforest jungle is so thick that they didn't waste time with agriculture. They built an entire culture organized around fishing. Until recently, their whole diet was focused around fish and clams. They ate thousands of tons of salmon every year. They were great seafarers who roamed the west coast in dugout canoes that were carved from a single enormous red cedar tree. And they fished everywhere they went, and they caught fish. Some of these canoes were big enough to carry 60 warriors, and they would routinely paddle back and forth between what is now Alaska and Seattle. And these canoes were built to last. As an example of how seaworthy they were, consider that in 1901, Joshua Slocum bought a used 100-year-old Nuu-Chah-Nulth dugout canoe from a native woman for $80 plus a bottle of rye whiskey. Now that's even older than my boat, the Mighty Bullshit, which will be a star on this TV show. On the Basstravaganza, we respect and revere old boats and old people and old ecosystems that have withstood the ravages of time. Anyway, here's a picture of that boat, and old Joshua himself there standing up by the bow. He renamed it Tillicum, decked it over, installed some masts, and then he sailed it around the world. I believe this canoe is still on display in a museum in Victoria. There's a really good book in Nanaimo Library by Hilary Stewart that documents some of the tricks the native fishers employed. They used long poles with detachable harpoon heads to stick giant sturgeon in 50, 60 feet of water in the Fraser River. They pioneered the concept of catching fish by using a fishing line. They made fishing line out of stinging nettles. They dried out those long, hollow stringers of bull kelp that you find on the beach and braided it together to make fishing line. And this is important to the Basstravaganza. They were not just fishermen, they were anglers. Did you ever wonder where that term comes from? We associate fishing with metal fish hooks nowadays, but metal fish hooks are a pretty recent invention. Until the Industrial Revolution, most fishermen around the world made hooks by attaching little pieces of hard wood or bone or stone together with glue or twine. You can see that in these drawings of Aboriginal hooks in Hilary Stewart's book. You can see that there's a huge variety of hook types. Each one was designed for a specific purpose, and the sharp pointed end on every hook was attached at a very precise angle. So in English, people who caught fish on hooks made of itty-bitty pieces of hard stuff connected at precise angles began to be referred to as anglers. And eventually hooks made of bent metal wire became much more effective, and no one uses hooks of bone or stone anymore, but the term stuck, and anyone who fishes with a hook and line is still called an angler. The earliest European sailors to explore and map the coast of Vancouver Island usually enjoyed lots of fresh fish, caught by native people and traded for metal or cloth or beads. If you read the journal of Captain G.H. Richards, who commanded British survey ships here around 1860, you find many references to this. Of course, the Aboriginal society here can't be described as a really advanced fishing culture because they never caught any bass. There were no bass here until the Canadian government brought them to BC on the train from Ontario in 1902. But the native people here were sure good at catching the fish they had available to them. And the native people on Vancouver Island are also important to the Basstravaganza because they're some of the earliest people we know of who fished with lures. They trolled handmade lures for salmon. Hilary Stewart shows a drawing of this lure that looks kind of like a shuttlecock you'd use in a game of badminton. They pushed this lure way down deep into the ocean with a long pole, and when they wriggled the pole, the lure would pull free, and because it was made of wood, it would float back up to the surface, and because of the way the fins were arranged in a spiral, the lure would spin and wobble and jerk around as it rose up in the water, which made it look alive, which made predator fish chase it. So lingcod would chase it right up to the surface, and then fishermen would spear them from a canoe. History is full of fishermen. And fish are women. The ancient Roman author Plutarch tells a funny story about the great queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, and her boy toy, Mark Antony, CEO of the Roman Empire. They were lounging around on Cleo's royal barge on the river Nile one day, fishing for the giant Nile perch that lived there, and everybody caught fish except Antony. He felt so humiliated in front of his mistress that he did a bad thing, something a bass fisherman would never do, could never do, because it's an accepted fact that no bass fisherman has ever been known to tell a lie. But Antony couldn't allow himself to get skunked again, so he cheated. He hired fishermen to catch some big perch and tie them up and kept them alive underneath the barge. And the next day when everybody went fishing again, he hired divers to swim down under the barge, and when he'd drop his hook down, a diver would take it and stick it into the hook of one of these captive fish and then let it go, and he'd reel it in. And so Antony started reeling in one big lunker after another, but Cleopatra figured out his sleazy trick. So that afternoon she sent her servants out to the fish market, and they bought a great big old dried up, shriveled up dead sea bass that had been shipped out to Egypt months earlier from the Black Sea. And the next day when they went back out fishing, she had her servant dive down under the barge, and when Antony dropped his line in, they hooked his hook into the mouth of this old dead fish, and next thing you know, old Antony gets a bite and he reels in this big dead shriveled up sea bass, and Cleo says, "Here's sport indeed." So she thought it was a big joke, but it turned out much worse, because she didn't just rain all over his fishing mojo, she crushed his self-respect as a fisherman and a man in the process, and everything went quickly downhill for both of them after that. The next thing you know, Mark Antony lost his nerve, and then he lost his next battle to Octavian, and then he lost his empire, and then he committed suicide, and then Cleopatra committed suicide, and it was all very tragic. So if there are any women watching out there, let this be a lesson to you from Humpty Dumpling. Never go out and outfish the man you love, so you just might destroy him. Here's a picture of another famous fisherman. His name was Jesus, and he had quite a reputation around the Sea of Galilee. In a sense, Christianity began as a religion of fishermen. Jesus was one of those guys who seemed to have a built-in sonar. He could always find fish. Now, this was way before my time, of course, so I'm not going to vouch for it, but many people say that there were days when everybody else in the village got skunked, and Jesus would go out and catch enough fish to feed the whole town. He wasn't the kind of guy to give detailed technical information about how to catch more fish. He didn't use his status as a fishing superstar to peddle his sponsors' products. He was more interested in changing the mindset of the fishermen around him than in seeing how many fish he could catch. Jesus was more than just a fisherman. He was also a notorious rabble-rouser. In those days, Judea was controlled by the great Roman Empire. But he went around telling people that they should disregard the empire because there was a higher law. He thought that the Romans were just a bunch of fat parasites who lived by taxing the poor people. The Roman gods were phony, and the only thing they really had going for them was a powerful military that could make your life miserable if you didn't pay them off. And like most revolutionaries, Jesus was pretty much tolerated and ignored as just another wingnut as long as he wandered around preaching to the rabble. His demise came about one day when he went into the bank and started talking trash to the moneylenders. And then he started tipping over their moneylender tables and throwing their moneylender money around, and they didn't like that. And so they arrested him and gave him a quick trial and nailed him to the cross. And that was the end of Jesus' legendary fishing career. Who knows, if he hadn't been executed, he might have gone on to win the Galilee Open fishing tournament and gotten lots of sponsors and become a big celebrity. But instead, he pretty much just vanished from history of fishing. There was another fellow around this time, a Roman named Publius Ovidius Naso, who is one of the first early fishing writers. We know him as the famous poet Ovid. And we often forget that he was also one of the first authors to write about bass fishing. Of course, Ovid was not talking about largemouth or smallmouth bass. He was fishing for Mediterranean sea bass, so we can't call him a real bass fisherman, but he left us with a few good one-liners about fishing and life. And he got into trouble with the Roman Emperor Augustus too, just like Jesus. But he didn't mess with the moneylenders, so he was exiled instead of being crucified. Now, if you study history, you'll find that there was a lot of immorality in those days, and Augustus decided to do something about it, so he enforced a period of moral reformation on the population. And overnight, Ovid went from being a rock star poet in the limelight of Rome to being a deportee exiled to the barren regions at the farthest end of the empire. According to Ovid himself, it was the result of what he describes as a poem and a mistake. It may have been Ovid's poem, The Art of Love, written in 3 BC, that got him in trouble with the moral majority. What we do know is that Emperor Augustus banished his own daughter, Julia the Elder, in the year 2 BC for immorality. And 10 years later, in 8 AD, the same year he banished Ovid, he also banished his granddaughter, Julia the Younger, for adultery. And rumor has it that Ovid may have been accomplice to that adultery. Or as other rumors have it, Ovid may have made the mistake of publishing the location of the emperor's secret bass fishing hole. In any case, Augustus shipped him out to the bleak fishing village of Tomi on the Black Sea, where he died. And here's a picture taken from James Henshall's famous Book of the Black Bass. It's a copy of a painting from a wall in Pompeii that got buried in the volcano there in 79 AD. Now, the lady on the right maybe wouldn't turn many heads today, but tastes change over time, and in her day, she was supposed to be just about the hottest babe around. Kind of like Paris Hilton of her era, you might say. Her name was Venus. And the little guy on the left, his name is Cupid, and he had quite a reputation of his own. And he's got a fish on his line, but you get the feeling, looking at this picture, that if that fish gets away and they end up getting skunked, well, it's not the end of the world for them. They'll wander off and find something else fun to do. Now, we're going to take inspiration from Venus and Cupid here at the Basstravaganza. If the fish get away or they won't bite at all, we won't be disappointed. We'll persevere and we'll allow our curiosity to lead us on into the beauty and wonder of nature. Now, the first real piece of fishing literature comes from the 2nd century, from a Greco-Roman poet named Oppian. Now, there was a new emperor by then, Marcus Aurelius, And Opian's father had offended one of his pals, so the emperor banished him to the Isle of Malta, just like Augustus had banished Ovid to the Black Sea. There seems to be a pattern here. Anyway, Opian grew up with his father in exile, and when his dad's enemy died in 169 AD, Opian went back to Rome and presented 3 of his poems to Marcus Aurelius. And one was about hunting, one was about fishing, and the other was about birding. And only the fishing poem called Haleutica has survived. Here's a piece of it. Good luck if you can make heads or tails of this scribble. It's Greek to me. If you translate it into English, you find that it's kind of like an early textbook on ocean ecology. The emperor was so impressed that he pardoned Opian's father, and he gave Opian a piece of gold for every line in his poems. And there are 3,500 lines in Haleutica alone. Opian was one of the first to use the word sport in connection with fishing. He's clearly intrigued by the mystery and challenge of understanding life forms that exist in another watery dimension. It's sad to say, Opian took his gold, went back home to Greece, and died of the plague. Here's a copy of a painting from China that's almost 1,000 years old. This is the earliest known picture of a person using a fishing rod and reel. It comes from a really early Chinese edition of Bassmaster magazine. The guy isn't catching anything. I mean, he's kind of an idiot, right? He's in cold water conditions. He should be throwing a deep running crankbait over underwater points or maybe drop shotting, but he doesn't care. It gets him out of the house. So as we follow fishing through time, we begin to see this split as early as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, like one species diverging into 2 and the 2 new species becoming really different from the one they evolved out of. One kind of fishing, commercial fishing, is concerned with catching fish for food. And the other kind, some people call it sport fishing, although I prefer the term recreational fishing, is focused less on catching fish and more on the pursuit of fish. And at the most extreme, we have the phenomenon of catch and release fishing and the Basstravaganza, where the objective is just the experience of fishing itself, and the intention is to let all the fish go. So on the next episode, we'll talk further about rods and reels and how they developed to meet the needs of recreational fishermen.